Hi, I'm Blood Moon, an Eastern Sergal. I decided to remake my first set of footpaws for my first suit because of multiple factors, the first of which was that they were just kind of awkward to walk in. I would continually stub my toe into things like the ground, which would cause me to stumble a bit. So, with the con crunch time upon me to complete them prior to AWU, I decided to try out Dream Vision Creations' Sergal Tone Foam Castings, which I had already purchased a few weeks earlier because, well, they look quite nice, though they are fairly expensive. All that said, I'm quite happy with the performance and look, with some learning along the way, which I hope to point out as we go. The first thing that I saw, and thought, how different can this be from normal foam, was right here. And the directions state, these can be used attaching an industrial glue with weight applied overnight, and then you can just hot glue the fur down to them once they are sufficiently adhered. You have to make sure that you really scratch up the inside of the toes before you try to glue them down, or you won't be able to get them to adhere to the surface. As we go along, you'll see that I thought that I was doing this right, but just kind of missed the mark. My first thought was to roughen up the surface with a razor blade to clear the thin skin from the foam castings, and then do similar to a set of cowboy boots that I wanted to try to use once again for my footpaws, which is really a route that just doesn't seem to work for me. So I changed directions here in a second. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and try to do some test fits, make sure that the toes look like they'll fit just fine. Put some glue down onto the surface of the foam casting and press it right onto the boot toe. Just figured that should work and hold it down in place. So I set it there for a few minutes and held it into place, making sure that really it made a pretty good adhesion, because, well, that's worked for me in the past using upholstery foam, so figured it'd work here. Not quite the same. I then figured add a little bit more glue and start filling up all these cavities, and it should hold just fine, right? No, not so much. So you'll see here in a minute how it just really doesn't adhere. Now, it might look like I just put the glue down and pulled off the toes, but it had been quite a while since the two had gone together, so I decided that I needed to reevaluate how I was going to do this. I decided to take a piece of a 180 grit sandpaper and sand down pretty much that area where I had scuffed up with the razor blade. And that really took off the surface skin quite well, but in the end I figured this is going to take forever if I had to keep doing this between all the toes, and it just really didn't plane it out very quickly, so this is sped up maybe 1,500 times, and you can see it's not making very much progress in a long period of time. Convinced that I wasn't going to get anywhere with my old cowboy boots, I quickly, and off camera, tore apart my Sergal toes I had previously made to get back to the Alpine Stars, and figured that this should help hold the toes together, as they're really a pretty comfortable and easy platform to work off of. And here we go, I decided to start gluing them on. My method was going to be pretty simple, overwhelm it with a lot of glue, and it seems to really hold pretty well. As I start adding a little bit more glue here, you'll notice that I really try to keep that glue off of the tongue of the shoe. That way, I can pull on it without really affecting the toes themselves. And since I'm going to go ahead and use these as outdoor footpaws, I'm going to use some EVA foam on the bottom and adhere the shoe and the toes to the EVA foam. So I'm just tracing out the pattern right now. As I start cutting out the foot pattern from the EVA foam, you'll notice that I flinch a little bit, and then somebody throws me a band-aid because, well, I caught the top of my finger just a tad bit and just really did a little puncture to it. So I add a little band-aid, fix that, and then keep going. But the razor blade is sharp. Reminder, be careful, because that freaking hurt. Now I'm just coming through and refining the shape just a tad bit, as I want those toes to really just blend right between the foot and the base quite well. And I take a little bit more off kind of by the heel there. And like I said earlier, I didn't quite think that the idea of just using sandpaper by hand was going to be the best idea, so I ended up taking this little Dremel tool and taking a about 180 grit, I think it was, sanding wheel. It really took that skin off pretty quick and effectively. However, you have to be real careful because it will take a lot of material off really quickly. I did have a ton of this little foam stuff blowing all over the place, so I ended up using it outside and just kind of grinding it out. So it worked out pretty well. Just be careful. There is a lot of foam and all that skin just kind of gets everywhere, and it's kind of statically. So it looks like it was actually 80 grit, but you can see it's just a lot of little pieces of sandpaper just kind of put together into a wheel. So it worked out quite well. It roughened up the surface a lot, and then I cleaned all of that off before I start blowing. So it worked out pretty well. Much better than just using the sandpaper by itself. So I did this with sandpaper just for a couple minutes, and then at the end, off camera, I took an air compressor and blew all this foam skin off. That way it wasn't there when I start blowing down fur. As I mentioned earlier, I did end up chopping off that piece of Velcro and replacing it with some of this elastic across the top of the foot. That way there was some tension to keep it kind of held in place, and I didn't have to work or worry about trying to tighten some Velcro inside of fur. So that really made things a lot nicer. It seemed to work quite well. It held up for 3 or 4 days while we were at AWU, and really had no issue with the foot just feeling loose or like it was going to fall off or anything. So it seemed to be a pretty good solution, and overall I'm pretty happy with it. And here we are, another one of those fursuit making boo-boos, getting hot glue all over your fingers and having to peel it off. But luckily this stuff wasn't too bad, so it just needed peeled off more than blistering or anything. I decided to throw some real thin, maybe 2 mil EVA foam around the back of the shoe here, just to give it a little more structure and to make it a little bit more smooth and everything. So I did that real quick and glued everything kind of in place. And then once I put it onto my foot, I traced out really the shape that I needed, as I didn't want it to rub oddly on my foot and cause blisters or just rash or anything. So taking it a little bit off the back here to kind of bring it in and to form shape to my leg a little bit more. And then I really decided that I don't want it as high as it is, so I chopped that off. And then I end up just putting fur by itself higher up and letting that just do all the work. And so far that's actually worked quite well, letting the fur just create its own structure, and I haven't had any issues with it. It sits real well, and I'm pretty happy with it. I decided to add a small piece of foam on the front here, just as a little bit of reinforcement, and then I'd make a big slit in the side of it. That way it's able to adjust and open up for that elastic to work. And then I add some more elastic on the outside, which provides a little bit more structure. So I made sure to keep it a little bit loose, but overall it seems to once again work quite well. Now somewhere along the way, I either didn't record or just ended up losing footage of me tape patterning the new toes. So here's a look at the original Sergal toes, and you can see quite a bit of difference between them and the new ones. You can tell I used a whole lot less foam around the back of the foot, and the length of the toes really ended up getting a lot shorter. But I did bring that foot patterning up quite a bit higher, so I did throw some foil because I didn't have saran wrap, and brought it up the leg, and then duct tape patterned that just a bit more so I can really just get that foot wrapped around my leg just about perfect. And I drew the patterning on the duct tape, and now I just slowly remove it as we go. I think I made a whole lot less pieces on this one because the toes last time were such a pain to start sewing together. So these are just nice long strips, about 8 of them really in total for the toes themselves, which is a huge improvement to like the 32 that I ended up having sewed together last time. So overall this worked out pretty well, and I really liked how everything kind of came together. Now as I start bringing all these little pieces of duct tape out, I place them down kind of in the correct order on my working pad here, and then get ready to start patterning it out on the fur. So really at this point it's create and then duplicate, and you'll see that I'm putting them all face up. That'll be for the opposite foot of what I'm actually working on, because the pattern you'll want the shiny non-sticky side facing down and the sticky side facing up for the piece that you actually pattern to. But I think I was working on the other foot on this one. It really is amazing how much fur that a set of foot paws actually takes up. So ended up using quite a bit of this, half yard or so. I think this is a seal skin or beaver fur, one of the two, but it works really well. I didn't have to shave it down, and sews real nicely. So ended up using a large chunk of it though. In this video, I don't think I've really mentioned, but you want to make sure that you're placing the pattern in the correct direction of the fur. So you want the fur typically facing towards the extremities. I'd say the big exception on that one might be kind of like the muzzle or nose area. Typically you want that kind of blowing backwards towards the face and maybe up towards the ears and everything, and then kind of down the neck. So you've got a lot of different competing directions on a head. But on the foot here, mine are typically facing downward or kind of towards the back, but really more towards the base of the foot. And then this piece is kind of towards the front of the foot, where I have that zipper area that I was talking about, or that area where it's held together with elastic. I put a zip in there, that way it's going to be easier for me to get in and out of the foot without it really being a problem. So put a zipper there. I've learned that, hey, there's an easier way to do it, but I did split it into 2 pieces rather than leave it as a single one and then chop it out later, which is a lesson I've learned for next time. And now I'm taking all the toe pieces and sewing them together. I could have done this via the machine, but I ended up just doing it by hand. I was sitting there watching The Walking Dead for about 3-4 weeks. Really probably why this video is taking about 2 months to get out, but in the end, we were just sitting there, so I figured might as well hand sew them together. And you can see that I'm kind of doing a little bit of a test fit on the toes and everything. So putting these pieces together slowly, one by one, and shoving them onto place and seeing how they're going to look. So overall, it looks like they're coming together. I think one of the biggest reasons I'm really doing the test fit is ensure that I'm sewing them at the right spot, because otherwise you can have toes that aren't quite in the right spot. So I just like to double check and make sure that they fit before I sew them in place, because I have made mistakes many times where I sew something and realize that should not have gone there. So then I have to cut it out and sew it all again, which is kind of demoralizing. It's painful. So at this point, I'm somewhat of a zipper virgin because I'd never actually sewn one together and had no idea really what I was doing. Seen my daughter do some things before, but never really had to fumble with it like I do now. So I end up putting the needles in and pinning it together. Discovered a little bit later that if I had just faced them the opposite direction, I wouldn't have to pull them out facing the little foot here, so that makes it difficult. But we have a zipper foot, which I didn't know about. Thanks to my daughter, she told me, hey, use this, it'll make it so much easier. And she's 100% correct. But I think I ended up using the needle on the wrong side, so I end up having to go back through and having it sew on the opposite side, further away from the actual zipper. But all in all, really was pretty easy, a lot easier than I expected it would be, and I'm pretty happy with the results. None of the seams have burst yet, so that's a win. But you can see I struggled a little bit trying to pull those needles out when they're facing the foot. And yeah, this right here, you can see that I actually swapped the foot over a little bit. That way it's sewing on the other side away from the zipper. So that was a lesson learned, but I already had one side kind of sewn. It made it so much easier to run it through the next time, and then do a little back stitch there just to make sure that the ends are closed up and it doesn't pull apart. Then I add the other side towards the zipper, and I think I've got the needles going the correct direction this time. That way I can pull them away from the foot. So all in all, a little bit of learning, but I thought it was really quite nice. And I think I'm going to start adding zippers to all my tails. That way I could unstuff them, throw them in the wash, and then stuff them back up again. So I think I also failed to mention that I'm a newbie. I've only been into fursuiting for about I guess we're coming up on 8 months now. This is really me still learning how to make everything and documenting how I do it along the way. So definitely not a professional, but kind of feeling my way through it, seeing how it works, and having a good time doing it. And you'll see this time, wow, so much easier to start sewing it all the way down. Really doesn't really take much to stop, continue, sew, and then backstitch, of course, one more time just to tie that knot up at the end. But I think in the end, it looks pretty good. Everything brushes out real nice. The seam is fairly invisible, but it still keeps the fur out of there. That way you really don't have the fur catching up into the zip too much, but even if it does, these are pretty chunky zippers, so it doesn't really get caught up and slow you down too much. I think I've mentioned this in all the other videos. Haven't really mentioned it a whole lot in this one because it feels very repetitive over time, but yeah, so I like to use either silver or black Sharpies as they don't tend to bleed as bad, and for me, if they do, really it's just black and white anyways for my overall color palette, so shouldn't be a huge deal if it does bleed, but I haven't had it bleed yet. At AWU, I've had to wash it out a few times and still haven't seen anything come through. So in the end, I like to use black and white, and then when I'm cutting out patterns from the fur, I tend to use a razor blade. That way I'm only cutting the backing and not the fur. But you can use scissors. Just go really shallow, take nice little snips without taking the fur tips off. That way you have real nice clean lines and you don't have some weird fur that's just chopped in a weird spot. So those are a couple of things. We use these little clips to bind the fur together, making sure that the fur is nicely tucked into the seams, and that way they're not sticking out, getting caught up in the needle as you use the sewing machine and stuff like that. Typically I use about a 1/8 inch to maybe a 1/4 inch of seam allowance, and then if I'm able to, because I'm using a sewing machine, I will trim those back a little bit, especially if it's on the face, but for the foot, I don't think I even trimmed them at all just because it was going to get stuffed between the toes and really didn't matter a whole lot. But yeah, that's kind of the big points that I haven't talked about in this one at all. But as we start brushing out the back of the foot here, I'm pretty happy with the way it's looking. I put some maybe 3-inch long fur on the very back just so it waves or blows in the wind a bit. As I finish sewing up the last little bit of the fur here, I also discovered that I just don't have any footage of me gluing the skin onto the actual foot base. So yeah, we've lost that. So in general though, I just slid the full sleeve onto the foot and then just worked my way from top to bottom, gluing pieces down and then getting real good between the toes. And I think along the bottom of the foot was really just gluing it nice and tight to the EVA foam base. And this is really kind of what I ended up with, was a Sergal foot. Nothing much to say there, but I ended up putting these little black arches in there just to kind of give that illusion of the toe curling upward. I did that on both sides. I cut little slits, and through the 3D printed, I think I ended up just using normal PETG filament on that and put it at an angle to stiffen up the strength of the claws, which survived going through AWU for a week or so. I did end up clipping a little bit on the toenails just to take that super sharp tip off, and then I just trimmed around the base there. So these do have a convention's worth of walking on them, and they held up pretty well, so I'm pretty happy with how they came out. So for the con, I pretty much just zipped my pants up right into the sleeve, or basically the fur, and then stuffed the zipper piece down in. I could flip that off, but I found that it's kind of nice to have that little pull tab when I have my paws on. You can pull it up a little bit tighter if needed, but they walk real well. Don't find myself tripping on anything, and thought they felt pretty good. The fur stays up by itself without really any backing or support. They're flexible, and you notice that the toes kind of have an upward curve, which I think in the end is kind of nice because it keeps your toes from dragging across the ground. You can tell I've got quite a bit of black on the tips from walking through a freshly oiled parking lot, but overall I'm pretty happy with how they work. And then they are tight enough that I can put my pants over top of it and have them kind of in this method and fashion as well, but I don't really care to have it that way. I feel like it kind of looks just kind of wrong. Well, if you made it to this point in the video, I appreciate it and thank you. If you skimmed all the way through, hey, thank you again as well. Overall, I want to thank you guys for joining in today. If you didn't like the content, please let me know. Please consider liking, subscribing, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.